Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon. Okay, so quick overview of the agenda today. So first of all, we're going to have a look at some of the more prevalent life science risk and current trends, starting by reflecting on the huge challenges facing the industry in 2020, then taking a step back to review some of the underlying characteristics of supply chains that shape the risk profile of the biopharma sector, and also understanding some of those major influences on supply chain disruption events. Having explored that broad universe of risks, we will then focus in on the consequences of major interruptions, regardless of the threat, and how to manage them. I'm going to outline 6 steps to strong supply chain management and also present the case for using an analytical approach to quantifying value at risk in the supply chain in order to prioritise your mitigation activities. And feel free to jump in if you have any questions. I'm happy to field those as we go. So let's start by trying to understand some of the challenges facing the life science industry today. So 2020 has presented huge challenges across all industries, but none more so than in the life science sector, which faced the double whammy of disruption to the normal running of supply chain, with staff being off ill, the inability to move goods through the supply chain, plus huge increases in demand, which couldn't have been anticipated or accommodated prior to the COVID pandemic. So we'll just start by having a look at some of the impacts in the US and then move on to the UK. This illustrates quite how severe the drug shortages were in the first quarter of 2020. Now, bear in mind, the information that I'm presenting is based on new drugs that are reported in shortage. So this doesn't take into account what was already in shortage, which was quite significant. Shortages were on the rise at the beginning of 2020. So just to explain what you can see in terms of the chart, when we collect interruption data from major regulators, and this is based on our analysis of the US FDA drug shortages that were reported during the first wave of pandemic. And the chart shows those newly reported shortages and the root causes as stated by the license holders. You'll see that in January, there were 19 companies that reported drug shortages, mainly due to discontinuations, which generally happen for commercial reasons. And this number rapidly ramped up to 71 companies reporting drugs in shortage by April. Now, the number of shortages being linked back to COVID resource constraints was relatively small. The main driver for this increase was demand for particular drugs, antivirals, anesthetics and sedatives that were used for mechanical intubation. So on reflection, the operation guys did a sterling job in keeping the patients supplied. It was the demand that was causing the real problems. There's a similar picture in the UK. A report has recently been released by the British Generics Manufacturing Association, which outlined huge increase in demand of certain drugs. Intensive care drugs increased by 5 to 10 times the normal rate. And this, coupled with major transportation issues, border closures, reduction in passenger flights, making getting the drug to the patient increasingly difficult, coupled with major industry events such as the Indian export ban, which resulted in a 21% reduction in APIs and 24% in finished goods reaching the British marketplace. So it's all pretty grim picture, but now many organisations are starting to look to the future, taking a step back and making detailed plans to increase domestic supply chain resilience. The idea being to secure the most medically critical products by stockpiling and encouraging more capacity into the market, partly by persuading existing marketing authorizations who don't actually manufacture products to use their authorization and start producing. So this method of protecting the most critical products by mitigating the most vulnerable supply points is a message that we've been delivering for many years now. So I'm going to really focus on just take a bit of an overview of the spectrum of supply chain failures, because I'm mainly going to focus on the major events, the high impact end of the spectrum, that product shortages, i.e. patients not getting their meds. So this is on the high impact end of the scale, and public shortages is the most publicly reported metric because it obviously represents a direct impact on the patients. In most circumstances, a product shortage means that not only one manufacturer is having problems with supply, but other suppliers are also experiencing disruption or are unable to ramp up to fill the gap. So the root causes for such high impact event tend to be industry-wide, demand variability, or as a result of a significant impairment for a single company. Moving back down the impact scale, there are a whole host of other lower impact risks that, if not managed, could escalate, but are still below the publicly reported radar because they're perhaps eroding safety stock rather than interrupting supply. And then beneath that, in the impact scale, you've got a whole host of other lower impact risks that, if not managed, could escalate. But these are centering around sort of day-to-day operations teams trying to manage those key performance indicators and meeting their on time in full targets, etc. And most of those risks are really talking about process of variability or control or quality deviations or plant reliability issues. So that's the full spectrum of supply chain failure. We're looking at not only the threats themselves, but the trends that exacerbate some of those threats. And over the last 10 to 20 years, the pharma supply chains have become increasingly fragile and vulnerable, partly because of certain initiatives, which all for good reason, for the best reason, but sometimes have an impact on supply chain resilience. For instance, lean or just-in-time manufacture, methodologies that aim to cut working capital and make supply chains more efficient actually reduce stock and remove backup facilities, making the supply chain less resilient. Another efficiency initiative, in the form of outsourcing to countries with lower labour costs, has focused industry dependencies on fewer API or contract manufacturers, and in doing so has created key cross-industry dependencies. And finally, we have the increasingly global nature of supply chains, resulting in increased complexity and decreased visibility. And this in turn exposes the supply chain to more volatile regions, increasing vulnerability to regional events and making central oversight more challenging. So with this general theme of decreasing supply chain resilience in mind, let's consider the diverse characteristics of supply chain in the life science sector. By splitting the industry into its three broad disciplines, biologics, traditional pharmaceutical and medical devices, we see that each are very different in terms of their underlying production processes and supply chain characteristics. So biologics are human, animal or cellular based processes, which by their nature are complex and unpredictable in terms of their manufacturing processes and often susceptible to heat and microbial contamination. This can make them difficult to manufacture consistently and difficult to copy, as is evidenced by the relatively small number of biosimilars. Traditional pharmaceuticals, in contrast, are made from chemical synthesis, and the associated manufacturing processes are generally more robust and repeatable. However, even within this sector, the supply chain risk characteristics of the innovative and generic manufacturers are very different. Supply chains manufacturing in-patent molecules deliver high-value products, often with months of buffer stock and high supply chain resilience, which is in stark contrast to their generic counterparts, which often run off low margins and don't have the luxury of safety stock or alternative sources. Then medical device supply chains are quite different again, more akin to high-tech or precision engineering supply chains, are dependent on the reliability of their constituent parts and, in some cases, their software control systems. And the pace of innovation and change within the medical devices industry is generally much faster than biologics or pharma, which again give them different characteristics in terms of resilience and the flexibility of their supply chains. Then we can move on to their suppliers, and that's an even broader set of characteristics. For instance, the petrochemical industry is reliant on chemical feedstocks. The pharma industry is reliant on for chemicals and APIs. The food industry, where frequently excipients and starting materials are sourced, and engineering components that provide novel delivery methods or medical devices. So this broad spectrum of manufacturing industry in turn comes with its large diversity of disruption risks. So for example, biologics manufacturers are dependent on human and animal donors, and their processes are susceptible to process variabilities that can't be predicted or precisely controlled. Pharma facilities can become contaminated, halting production for lengthy clean downs, or regulatory inspections can reveal CGMP failings, resulting in plant shutdown and other major disruption risks. Then the medical device manufacturers face a different set of significant threats. Cyber breaches, which can compromise their software, and even material defects that can create long-term unsafe products. Then on the supply side, when you look at different industries, they have their own major disruption risks, dependencies on livestock herds, which could become contaminated by infectious disease, wiping out the source of serums for cell media, petrochemical industries, suffering from perhaps the scarcity of a key raw material, and low margin business such as engineered components that can become financially stressed during economic cycles. So a huge spectrum of disruptive risks, and that's without the environmental risks such as natural catastrophe, pandemic, economic crisis that have potential to impact all industries. So it's a very complex picture in terms of sources of risks, and pharma manufacturers often find themselves in the relatively weak position, being dependent on a small number of specialist suppliers that are only prepared to make low volume orders with high levels of documentation based on a reasonable reward, but very often that monetary reward isn't sufficient to incentivize many players into the market. So building resilience into your supply base can be very different. It's a pretty small pond that we fish from in the pharma world. So despite all those differences in the range of threats and supply chain characteristics, there is a common denominator, which is obviously regulation. All three sectors exist within a restrictive regulatory framework and have to comply with stringent regulatory measures that are in place to protect patients from harm, but can have that same principle can count against the patient when something goes wrong in one of those fragile supply chains, because the loss of a critical supplier or contract manufacturer can result in lengthy outages whilst an alternative is established, validated and approved by the regulators. So a disruption event in the pharma industry can take a very long time to resolve, resulting in lengthy product outages. So a bit more detail on some of those underlying influences behind the supply chain interruptions and drug shortages of recent years. Putting COVID aside again, in the in-depth research that has been published in the last couple of years has revealed a number of underlying influences, some of which will be no surprise, some will be less obvious. And this slide draws together conclusions from an FDA drug shortage report that was published in 2019 and a separate study that Intersys led in collaboration with the University of Cambridge as part of a project called Remedies. So from 2016, a series of government accountability reports and FDA reports came to the conclusion that the most likely drug type to be in shortage is a generic injectable. The 2019 FDA Task Force report goes further to suggest that the reasons for this are both commercial and quality related. Companies making older generic drugs that are under intense pricing competitions are less able to invest in the more robust quality management systems. And even when a drug becomes scarce, the normal market forces do not encourage the correction of this situation, i.e. the lack of price rises fail to attract new capacity to the market and don't resolve the shortage scenario. So there's recognition of this tension between low drug prices and low quality management system, which results in supply chains that are more likely to break. Another interesting result of the FDA report is that it is the older drugs with a median time since approval of 35 years that are more likely to be in shortage. And moving on to the separate study of FDA product shortage root causes, this time in 2018 by the Remedies project. It too verified the sterile injectables as the most likely drug to be in shortage and went on to quantify that 69% of companies with drugs reported in shortage had experienced an adverse inspection outcome in the previous 4-year period. So this isn't just a coincidence. An adverse inspection or an OAI result often triggers remediation work, which can in itself result in prolonged plant shutdowns and many months of delay if regulatory reapprovals required for the mitigations. And then finally, there's the issue of where in the world medicines are made. Research indicates that outsourcing manufacturing to companies with less mature regulatory systems results in more frequent GMP non-compliances. As you know, the industry is highly dependent on China and India for the supply of APIs and some finished drugs, but their regulatory track record has been demonstrably lower than the rest of the world, as evidenced in the next slide, which shows the results of a study of the number of OAIs, official actions indicated, following FDA inspections over a 10-year period, normalized by the number of inspections, and it clearly shows on India and China in the red, i.e. having the worst track record of OAIs per inspection. So now you have a feel for the broad range of threats facing the pharma supply chains. Let's switch our focus to managing the consequences. If a large disruption is going to happen in your supply chain, the chances are that it will stem from a large number of unlikely events occurring around the same time, and being incredibly difficult to anticipate that train of events. So in many ways, your efforts are better spent in identifying your most vulnerable supply nodes and putting contingencies in place to respond to those interruption events, regardless of the source of the risk. So, with respect to third parties, what do? You have thousands of suppliers which all look equally important on paper, but how do you identify and manage the key supply-related vulnerabilities? Do you wait for something to go wrong? Do you just look at the suppliers that you spend the most money with? Or perhaps you do a general risk assessment of the threats facing your key products? Well, the last of those is a good start, but really the best way to tackle this problem is to quantify the value at risk for critical dependencies across key products and put controls in place to reduce those financial exposures. In other words, quantified supply chain risk assessment. But quantifying value at risk for key supply nodes takes effort. So why do it? Well, the benefits of quantifying supply chain vulnerabilities mean that you could have competitive advantage in the event of a crisis. You're ready to respond, able to limit reputational damage and potential losses, and you're able to get there before your competitors in the event that disruptions impact a swathe of industry. Furthermore, quantification of value at risk enables a cost-benefit analysis of risk mitigation options. If you put a value on the failure of a supply node, you might just be able to justify to your accountants the need to hold strategic stock and the need to validate strategic supplier alternatives, or even to know how much insurance to buy if you get business interruption cover. So I'm going to take you through the 6 steps to strong supply chain risk management based on a quantified approach to identifying your most vulnerable supply nodes. The first step is to identify key suppliers using criticality criteria. Now, these criteria will be dependent on your business, but generally you will look to establish characteristics of uniqueness, either in terms of a supplier, perhaps one that controls unique IP or makes a very specific grade of material, or simply is the only supplier that has enough capacity to meet your needs. So a simple scorecard approach can help you identify, based on these criteria, which suppliers you're most vulnerable to. And that's the first step in reducing your 1,000-strong supply base to those that are most critical and deserve most scrutiny. Then focus on those medically critical or high revenue products and map your critical internal and external supply chain dependencies against your most critical products. Relating each supply node to multiple products enables you to put a number on the value at risk if that supplier goes down. For each key supply node, think about how much downstream stock you've got protecting it and how long it would take to establish an alternative in an emergency in order to establish and estimate the value at risk. And then if you can do that for one product, you can look at the total value at risk offered by that site or supplier across your portfolio of products. And once you have that critical list of supply nodes, think about the threats and scenarios that you might wish to model. It could be geographically based. Is your supplier in an earthquake zone that you're particularly worried about? A number of suppliers in the same area? Are there a group of suppliers that could cause you concern because of financial instability? Or do you simply want to find out what the financial impact of a 1, 2, 3, 6 or 12-month outage period might be across your total portfolio? By overlaying this threat scenario onto your critical supply map, you can come up with a hit list of supplier sites that could hurt your business most. And that's the next step, prioritizing your risk mitigation activities based on impact. Look across your portfolio of products and for each your site or supplier, sum the impact across each product. And that total exposure across your portfolio gives you a hit list in terms of where your most vulnerable supply points are, and that in turn allows you to justify spending some money to mitigate those most vulnerable supply points. Now, in terms of supply chain mitigation strategies, this slide gives you an idea of some of the theoretical controls that you can put in place. As far as the life science industry is concerned, there's 3 main mitigation methods. You can either increase your downstream buffer stock, your finished pack or your API holding, or a stock of a critical material, or you can maintain excess capacity in your own supply network, or perhaps look to your external supply base and validate multiple sources so that if there's a problem with one supplier, you know the validation work has been done that enables a more rapid recovery at an alternative. So now we're on to step 6. So we know where our vulnerabilities lie within our supply chain, and we've got an action plan for mitigating those high value risks. So the final step is to monitor the status of that critical list. In a survey conducted by KPMG a couple of years ago, they noticed that 9% of their respondents said they could respond to the impact of a disruption in a matter of hours. Only 9%. 17% said it takes them 3 weeks or longer. So it's clear that being ahead of those numbers suggests competitive advantage. And the world that we live in contains a huge amount of data that you can draw on to get early warnings of those kind of problems in your supply chain. So alert feeds are available for natural catastrophe alerting, security and political risks, financial health checks, and quality or non-compliance reporting metrics are also available. So those are my 6 steps to strong supply chain management. Let's just finish with a quick recap on where we've gone today. So there's a huge number of threats with potential to interrupt life science supply chain, and there's obviously value in mitigating individual sources of risk. However, organisations must be prepared for the unexpected and must be able to deal with those high impact, prolonged outages and those low frequency type risks, those unthinkable risks. And the way to do that is to identify critical vulnerabilities in your supply chain and justify the mitigation of those risks through value at risk quantification. And once you have that critical list of supply nodes, then monitor them so you can be the first to act if something major goes wrong. So if 2020 has taught us one thing, it's to be prepared for the unthinkable. Life science supply chains are complex, fragile constructs which hide critical industry-wide dependencies and concentrations of risks. Understanding those risks and putting mitigations in place to deal with them is a key competence for any life science manufacturing company today. So, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, then please fire away.